Page 2, Happy Together. I want to point out a few things in here. I'm going to start with the right hand. Look at the fingering right at the beginning. Starts with the thumb, then reach out and put the second finger on the E. Don't forget the F sharp. In that first full measure, you're playing that first note, the G, the eighth note, with the fourth finger. That means you're playing the F sharp with the third finger. But then look a little further over, and now you're going to play the F sharp with the second finger. The first note in the second line on page 2 in the right hand, third finger on the F sharp, because you just finished this little run. So now it's third finger on the F sharp. Be aware of all these little fingering things. I don't want to go through here and have to point out each one. All right, just be aware that follow their fingering except for the stuff I'm about to point out now, because I want to change some of this fingering. You could get away with using their fingering if that's what you want, but I think my fingering is a little easier, so I'm going to suggest it to you. In the third line, first measure on page 2, you have this to start. And then they're saying for the 2 E's to do a second finger. And then a 1. I find that awkward. It works, but I find it awkward. So I would recommend after the first beat, on the 2 E's, do a 2-3. 4 on the F sharp. And this way, on the next measure, you can do a 2 on the D sharp. I find that much more comfortable than having the hand up in this area up here. On page 2 in the last line, take a look at the last 2 measures. They're suggesting for these eighth notes, it's a 1, 2, 3, 4. And the melody's the top note, and that's what you connect, okay? The other notes, the bottom note, when they occur, you don't really have to connect them so much. It's the melody that we need to hear. However, I find this fingering a bit cumbersome. So I would suggest you do this. Instead of a thumb on the first one that you use, because you just used a thumb on the note before it. Here, in the measure before, you just played an E with the thumb. Now they want you to use the thumb again. I would suggest you play that first eighth note with a second finger, F sharp with the fourth finger, the A with the thumb, and then you can continue with the fourth finger. Okay? If you're doing the arpeggios, this comes up. That's what that is. It's common. Now in the last measure, instead of a 1-3, I recommend a 2-3. So it's that. You get the same thing over on top of page 3. Just back up a little bit. Okay. At the bottom of page 2, in the second measure, the last line, they're showing a 1-5 for the G sharp E. I recommend a 2-5. Because the 2's going to play the G sharp anyway, 2 beats later, so why not let it do it now? We'll go through. You get the same thing on top of page 3, the last 2 measures. It's here. And then that same fingering I suggested before. I think that works very nicely, and I recommend it. Now, on page 3, fourth line down, second measure in the right hand, we've had this already. Over on page 2, for the 2 E, the 2 E eighth notes, I recommend a 2-3. And then a 2 on the D sharp, the last measure. It's also on the last line, second measure, I recommend a 2 on the D sharp. Then in the last measure, on page 3, I recommend a 2-5. But you can do a 1-5 if you want. Okay, I just find it more comfortable to do a 2-5. Now, one minor thing that happens in a couple of places. On page 2, third line down, second measure in the right hand, that D sharp is tied. It's a quarter note tied to a dotted half note, like a whole note, really. So when you play the B, don't play the F sharp or the D sharp again. Hold it down. So you play the B by itself, but you're going to sound both notes. Just be aware that it's tied. That happens again on page 3. Fourth line down, last measure. Same thing. Happens again in the last line. Second measure. Ought to have it down by then, I hope. Now for the left hand. Not a lot going on here. You've got these quarter notes, this repetitious pattern with the 5-1, the figure. Telling you to accent every one. We're moving around a little bit. Second line, it goes down, down again. Now when you get to the third line on the second measure, I recommend their fingering a 2-5. I do that anyway. I'm surprised they don't want you to do a 1-5, but a 2-5 is better. The tricky part about the left hand, and you're saying, what's tricky about the left hand? They're accented. They're showing them accent. I'm not sure why, unless they want you to separate them slightly. See, some people will interpret an accent as separate the notes. Don't play them connected. They want. That's a personal thing. There's no rule says it has to be that way. All right. Some band conductors, orchestra conductors will insist on it, and others, no, they don't want that. Some do it sometimes, not others, I don't know. But the hard part about the left hand here is the dynamics, the loudness. It's too easy when it's this low to overpower what's going on above it because it'll be too loud if I do that. Yuck, all right? So you got to remember and fight that as you play this to keep that left hand soft, even though it says it's accented. So be aware of that. That's the hard part in the left hand. At the end of the piece on page 3, in the left hand, the last line, I would recommend, see, from the measure before, the last measure of the next to the last line, the fourth line down, you're doing a 2-5. I recommend a 3-1 then for the first measure of the last line. That way your hand doesn't really move around. This is one hand position. It's an extended position that works. The second measure, you're going back down. And then for the last measure, you're up there again, and I do a 3-1. So the left hand doesn't have to move around so much. Now for the pedal. You pedal pretty much as they tell you to, with a few minor changes. Page 2, third line, last measure, the first ending there. The pedal's down when you're playing these. I recommend you lift the pedal with the right hand. So we get a little bit of silence in the right hand before we start the next. It doesn't mark it as a phrase, but it is a new phrase. It's here, and then we want that 8th note silence. We'll lift the pedal up so we actually get silence in the right hand. Okay, so right after you play that third beat in the left hand, lift the pedal up right when you play it. Otherwise, you're playing it pretty much legato pedal. That's overlapping pedal throughout. For instance, at the bottom of page 2 in the first measure, that second ending, you're pedaling each of these notes. You're coming off of here, and then for the second beat, you're going to here, play the notes, then lift, then change. We call it change the pedal. You just lift it up and put it back down. Next beat, change pedal. Play the notes first, then change pedal, and then continue. last measure on page 2, I recommend you change pedal with the 8th note in the right hand so we don't get this. Okay, change it with the last chord there. Alright, regardless of what the left hand's doing, do that there. So it's the same thing over on page 3, second line, first measure. You have exactly the same thing. Change the pedal with the 8th note. On page 3, on the second line, on the second measure, going into the third measure, they're saying lift the pedal up at the first beat of the third measure. I'm saying lift it up before. So if I play the last 2 measures there on page 3 of the second line, it's here. So I'm lifting the pedal up before I play the notes in the third measure. And that's pretty much it on the pedal. At the end, the last measure, you're going to lift the pedal in the hands at the same time. Right there. And after the 8 counts, because there's a fermata there, then we'll lift everything together. The only other thing is, as I've been doing in these demos, the 8th notes. We're swinging the 8th notes. There's a note at the bottom of page 2 to do that. And it's the style of the piece. So yeah, we'll swing them. Other than that, I really don't have a lot to say about this piece. It's just a really fun piece to play. So let's try it together, slowly. You can speed it up on your own. Now, I like to play these things slowly so you can hear the notes, because we're not trying to perform it. You can play it with me one hand at a time for a while, till you get it. So I'm going to keep it really slow. I'm going to keep it at 60, which is really slow. So let's try this out. It has a pickup, 1.5 beat pickup. So I'm going to give us 2.5 beat counts. It would be like ready and go. So go ahead and put your hands up where they go. Foot's on the pedal. Here we go. Ready and go.